I'm sorry, people who are across the world. Uh, I hope you have something good at home. Uh, I'm Elaine Petrocelli, and I get to be the person to introduce two of my favorite authors. So I'm very excited about today. Uh, First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming and giving up whatever you are doing this afternoon. Thank you. And if you haven't received your book yet, you will give it to you on the way out. So you will get it. And I really want to introduce you to Carol Edgarian, who is one of my favorite local authors, but nationwide great author. If you haven't read Vera, well, an incredible book set in the early 20th century in San Francisco. The earthquake is in it, Caruso's in it, Boss Abe Ruff is in it, but more than that, there are some fabulous women in that book. So I hope you'll have a chance to read that, and also her other books. And she is a member of the national community. She founded and is part of Narrative, a group that makes get closer to the mic. I've been told. Thank you, ma'am. A group that makes ebooks available to students all over the world. And so you'll see she's amazing. And then there's this unknown author, Emma Donoghue, who we are so excited came back to us and crossed the border from Canada and for us. And we're really, really touched because we have not been very nice to Canadians. But I have loved all of her books, and I hope you have too. And if you've missed some, we'll try to make sure you find something else to do this weekend because you're going to have two books to read. What I want to say about the Paris Express, because I think most of you know about Emma. I can tell you about all of her awards. I can tell you how she did in elementary school, but I'm not going to do that because I love this book, Paris Express. And I was telling Emma backstage that when I was a child, back in another century, which is true, we used to take the train to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan from Indianapolis. And trains were pretty nice. There were dining cars with, napkins and tablecloths, and you talked to people, and it was fun. But my mother, who was I think she should have been a writer because she had this great idea. It was a long journey, and she would say to me, "See that woman over there? What do you think she's really like?" And we would talk about her. And then, how about that, the conductor? Where do you think he lives and how do you think his life is? And so we would imagine, but we didn't know. Well, with the Paris Express, you were on a train in France coming from Normandy up to Paris in 1895 when trains were spaceships of their time. And the people on the train are so fascinating. And part of when I think of Emma and her genius, she always lets us into the lives of not just the main character, but everybody in the book. We know them all. So here are all these people, some in first class, some in third class, some in second class. There's a 7-year-old boy. There's a woman who is rather strange and won't let go of her lunchbox. I'm not going to tell you any more because then you'll know too much, and I don't want to spoil it for you. But I've got to tell you, this is an incredible book with you think when you're started that you know how it's going to end, and you don't. So have fun, and my great thanks to Emma Donoghue and Carol Edgarian.
Thank you so much, Elaine. It's fantastic to be back here. I'm having a perfect day off in the middle of book tour. I got to go to the Muir Woods with my sister and, not talk about myself for a few hours. So now I'm ready to obviously talk about myself again.
Well, I thank you, Elaine, and I am so thrilled to be here with you, Emma. And, I think my first question um, is really, you're from Ireland, you live in Canada. Will you take us all home with you?
Well, you're a big nation. And I'm traveling very light. I never check bags. So I have to live for 2.5 weeks out of one carry-on. But I'll do my best. I understand.
Okay, well, we're very grateful.
These are emergency conditions.
Look at this wonderful group. Yay, all of
know.
you. 4:00 in the afternoon.
Have you nothing better to do with your time?
Fantastic. Well, let's start at the beginning, and I don't think we should assume. How many of you read the book? Okay, so we don't want to have spoilers, but let's start at the beginning. You were spending a year in Paris.
Yeah.
And a photograph.
Well, I needed to find somewhere for my family of 4 to live in Paris because it was my partner's sabbatical year. She's a professor of French. So the only place I could find us a 3-bedroom apartment was an area called Montparnasse on the south side. That, it's a famous name, but I hadn't spent much time there. It's not particularly touristy. So I just thought, well, I'll Google the area to see did anything interesting ever happen there. And suddenly, in 20 different forms on my screen was this same photograph, an astonishing image of a train in a state of crisis, shall we say. And I thought, okay, I have to find out what happened that day. And I had a strong feeling immediately that was going to be my next book. And I've never chosen a topic to write about before going to a place. Often after I've lived somewhere like, say, Nice in the south of France, I have written about it afterwards. But this, for the first time, I knew in advance, and I did some research in advance. So by the time I was living in Montparnasse, I was already living in 1895 as well as 2022. So, walking our daughter to school, I'd spot a bit of a marking on the wall of a building, and I'd go over and find that it was a hatch where you left babies if you'd given birth outside wedlock. And, you spun the thing round and rang a bell and ran away. Luckily, street signs in Paris, they all not only have the name of the obscure person the street is named for, but then there's always a little mini bio. So the streets of Paris are sort of palimpsestic, layers and layers of information to be read. And I found it such a pleasure to live there, both as a person and as a writer simultaneously.
That's fantastic. So did you, of course you were researching while you were there, but were you researching, or were you?
Yeah, both. I would say after a few months I start to actually write, but of course the research is never done with a historical novel. I have found even at the proofreading stage, a proofreader will ask one tiny question and suddenly you're like, oh, I don't know enough about that area. And back you go. Or consulting the sources again, because the great thing about the multiple online sources that there exist now for writing historical fiction is that they keep being added to, and it's always worth going back and doing a further scan with slightly different keywords. So for this train crash, which happened on the 22nd of October 1895, I began with about 40 articles in French newspapers, and although I've never learned to really speak French fluently during my many times there, I can read it all right. So I used these articles. And then I started looking up facts about the people I knew who'd been on the train that day. So the crew of 4, that's 2 guards, a stoker and a driver. And luckily, French society is very bureaucratic. Even now, for our daughter to go on a school trip, we had to give copies of our passports as well as hers, So I was able to find out not only where these men lived and what their wives were called, but what their military records had been. So I found quite a bit of information. And then also genealogical sources allowed me to look up lots of other people. I knew there'd been certain passengers on the train that day because they'd been interviewed after the disaster. And this included 3 VIPs, members of parliament who were on their way from their country houses in Normandy or Brittany back to Paris. And that turned out to be, in a nutshell, why the accident happened, because one of these VIPs, a very entitled man who was a banker as well as a member of parliament and a former minister, he asked if this express train could make an extra stop in the village near his house to attach on his private carriage. And this one little bit of, greed and arrogance basically cost the train 10 minutes, meaning it delayed it by 10 minutes. And in my native Ireland, this would be just an average day on the train system. Right. You'd be lucky if it was only late by 10 minutes. But Paris in the 1890s was a city of modernity and progress and speed and consumerism. And the railway companies prided themselves on getting their passengers to Paris on time. So it was unacceptable to be 10 minutes late. And so the driver felt under massive pressure to make up that time. And not just vague pressure, but financial pressure, because the wages of the staff of the train were up to 40% higher if they maintained a consistent punctuality. So the seeds were sown there for a terrible disaster to arise out of the selfish whim of one customer. That was such a long answer, I can't remember where we began.
It was a great answer. Structure is so important in your work. And I wondered in reading it, the whole novel takes place in a day. Was that the original concept, or how did you get there?
Well, as soon as I started reading about this particular train disaster, I decided that it would be a waste to take this material and make anything loose or baggy out of it, because it's not just a train journey, it's an express train. It's all about speed, and the accident happened because of speed and excess of speed. So I immediately knew that the book should follow the timing of the journey, 8:30 in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and that it should be shaped like a train, and it should have a lot of forward thrust and narrative momentum. And early on in my research, I discovered that trains didn't have dining cars or bathrooms or even corridors. So there was none of that strolling through the train or, running away from the guards. You were stuck in your carriage while the train was in motion. And then I realized this was actually very helpful, because it meant I could have chapters which were moving, where you'd be, all the characters would be stuck with whoever they were in a carriage with. And then there would be brief chapters at each stop where people had a chance to jump off the train and, rush and buy a sandwich or try and find a toilet. So it would be like a game of musical chairs structurally. So I found that a real plus. Once I'd surrendered to the fact that, that the trains didn't have corridors, I thought, okay, this is going to help shape the novel.
That really surprised me about the bathrooms, I have to say.
I need to teach you all a word. Ladies would travel with a bourdelou, which is a French word for a kind of a picture a gravy jug, an elegant ceramic gravy jug. You'd pop it under your skirts, you'd pee into it, and then you would hand it to your husband, who would empty it out the window. So that's how they did it.
Maybe we won't linger there too long.
I've lowered the tone. I know. I'm sorry. We were eating our French madeleines and our palmier pastries, and I've lowered the tone. Well, the French have an earthy side, I've seen women actually squat down to pee in the street in Paris, It's an earthy place.
I love the earthy aspect of the book. I thought that was fantastic. So you have a proclivity for these confined spaces.
I don't know how other authors manage to, write epic sweep and cover, so many different environments and so on. I find it, much easier to get a good story out of a situation of limitation. It's not that I'm a psychopath. I don't particularly want my characters to suffer, but I find that it sort of turns the temperature up between characters, and that it reveals character quite quickly if you limit people. It's not always a locked room. Sometimes the confinement is self-chosen. So my novel Haven, about 3 Irish monks, they've chosen to go live on this weird little spiky rock in the middle of the Atlantic. But it often is a situation of of having your hands tied or of limited options for the characters. And I just like what it does to them. But also I'm very interested, how I got into historical fiction, I suppose, was being interested in women's history and writing women back into history. And most women's lives, face it, have been too small and too stuck at home rather than too roaming too far afield. There's been an awful lot of, girls not getting freedom to go do anything or have adventures. So I think, that probably was one source of my interest in locked in lives.
Yeah, I love that. So that leads us to our young anarchist. Do you want to talk a little bit about her?
Sure. One reason for this character is that when the journalists interviewed some of the locals when the disaster happened, several of the locals in Paris independently said that they had assumed it was an anarchist bomb when they heard the sound. And I thought, really? So yes, random acts of terrorism in public were already common in the 1890s, and they came from the extreme left. And there had been, say, the French president had been stabbed to death the previous year. There had been bombs in restaurants and in the parliamentary assembly. So is not what in fact happened that day. But I thought, how interesting if it might have. So let's complicate the story by adding an anarchist, I thought. Also, I knew that this would be like what they used to call a social novel, a novel of social commentary, because a train is such an obvious microcosm of an entire society with its, segregated carriages and its divisions according to wealth and so on, that I thought, okay, I need somebody to be critical of all the aspects of French society, which were, brutally indifferent to the lives of the poor. And you don't want a character just ranting. And I thought, if I have somebody on there who thinks her society is so terrible that she wants to destroy it, she'll be the right person for this kind of description of her society. She'll really have a stake in it. So I looked around for a good anarchist. And anarchist characters in 19th century fiction, they're typically mysterious, gaunt Eastern European men, big overcoats. And I thought, actually, if I choose some young, fresh-faced radical, then the reader will have more of an interestingly mixed response, because we won't sympathize with the cause probably, but we will sympathize with the person. So I found this young woman who was in radical circles at the time, and her name was Madeleine Pelletier, and she was just such a fighter. She was eaten up with hatred of the church, which had, she'd gone to religious schools. She was so outraged by the position of women that she wore men's clothes, because she said, I'm not going to wear the mark of subjection, She seems to have, been heterosexual, but she said, I'm not going to marry a man until we're equal. So she was just, full of rage. Rage was her fuel. And I thought she'd make a great character. So yes, I brought her in. I could have, by the way, to fill up my train, I could have invented characters, but 1890s Paris was so full of interesting and varied people that I had no need to. I decided I would include anybody who could potentially have been on the train that day, because we don't know who was. There was room for about 100 people on there. So I thought, well, I'll include anyone who was really around. So we have a young Irish man called John Synge, who we may know would go on to be the most important Irish playwright, but he doesn't know that. He thinks he's just a student drifter. We've got people from Cambodia and Algeria and visiting from America and emigres from Russia. I mean, historical fiction writers often try and make the past seem interestingly varied and diverse, but in this case, France really was like that. So I had no trouble choosing a really wide variety of characters.
Yeah, it's a great group. Where did Blonska come from? She's sort of the wise soul of the train.
Yeah. Trying to remember how I first came across her. She's basically she was a Russian intellectual sort of volunteer social worker, in that she worked as a secretary or librarian for some literary men. But then in her spare time, she would go off and just find people who were, broke or in trouble, and she'd give them money. And so her rich lady friends would do their sort of charitable doings through, she went by her last name Blonska. And I also know that she wore this orthopedic corset because she clearly had some kind of spinal twist. So I just loved the idea of this 60-year-old Russian woman, living austerely and saving all her money to give to others and living in constant pain, and yet with this sort of, indomitable approach to life and wanting to just do her best to make the world better. And I thought she'd be a lovely corrective to the angry young anarchist. So it was a bit like being a salon hostess going like, ooh, that person would like to talk to that person. Though in my case, I was often sort of arranging arguments as much as bonds. I was like, oh, that priest will be extremely irritated by the anarchist. And, that person might flirt with that person. So I brought people together if I thought that, sparks might fly between them. And
that's where it gets fun, right? And I think one of you, I should pose this as a question, the train as character, engine 721. I couldn't help but feel you had a little love for the train. It's the most lovingly described character in the book.
She's an example of how I'm a planner, as writers go. I plan things meticulously, but she was a late addition because I realized I had all this material about trains and the train system and how it was, it was this force pulling France and the whole world together. It was like sort of high-speed strings between different parts of the world. So, a cheesemaker in rural Normandy could suddenly get his camembert to New York before it would go too stinky. I mean, they like it stinky, but not too stinky. So, it was this massive force for trade and travel and the spread of ideas. And, I had all this material, but there didn't seem any one of my characters who'd be saying or thinking these things. And then I finally thought, it's the train. And I liked the idea that the train might be able to sense the thoughts of some of the people traveling in her. So yeah, she was a late surprise for me. And I decided she would be she because men who work on big vessels, I think like sailors, have almost always called the vessel she. And, the train companies used to make sure that the driver and the stoker and the train always worked together. It was like a three-way partnership because the better they knew each other's little quirks, the more smoothly they'd be able to communicate and get to Paris on time. So the driver and the stoker, for instance, they were 8 hours on this little plate, unsheltered in the cold, and they wouldn't have a chance to speak to each other because of the deafening noise. So they had to be able to work together just by glances and gestures and work really smoothly together and almost read each other's minds and read the landscape and know when you needed more steam and when you needed to let off. So it's one of the most enjoyable times I've ever had researching the world of a particular job, and trying to understand exactly what they would do and what they would be worrying about at every point.
I love the grittiness of how you did that beautifully. I mean, we were right there. We can taste the soot. And also, they're not always thinking about running the train, by the way. They're thinking about other things.
I've never had a real job, right? Some writers, by the time they turn to fiction, they already know how to be, rodeo riders or, CEOs or whatever. But I've only ever done this, right? So I have to do this kind of thing by research rather than by experience. And I absolutely loved getting into the nitty-gritties of how you would keep an engine thundering along,
It's fantastic. So you just said something, and I wanted to go a little deeper. So are you an outliner?
Yes, I'm
and
a planner rather than a pantser. Only if I want to. I mean, yes, I usually do. Basically, outlining helps me to overcome a weakness, which is I'm not naturally good at plot at all. I can do dialogue till the cows come home. But, my plots in my earlier novels were much more meandering and lifelike. And then from about the late 90s, I began to be more interested in trying to achieve more of an exciting, suspenseful feel. Because often I was working with really dramatic material, like, say, a divorce case or something. And I would think, okay, it's going to be a waste to write a meandering novel about this. I want to grip people. So I do find that planning in detail allows me to spot, big flaws or longueurs, boring bits, basically. Because if I write out what's going to happen in each chapter, I find myself going, chapter 5 looks pretty much exactly like chapter 2. So maybe we could cut chapter 5. And it allows me to do things like, oh, maybe I'll drop in a hint to the reader of what's going to happen there, or maybe I'll only introduce this character on the fourth station. So it basically allows me to improve my plotting. And I'm amazed that some writers can just do all this in the back of their minds without even being fully conscious of it, but I can't. But yes, I let myself deviate from the plan at any point, because unlike in, say, architecture, nothing's going to fall down if I change a detail. And I once, for instance, in my first historical novel, Slammerkin, two of my characters were clearly flirting with each other, and I only noticed this after a draft of the whole book. I was like, really, you two? I had not planned this, and I felt a little miffed, but I went back and wrote in a love affair for them. So yes, you can always change your plans.
Yeah, it's great when that happens, isn't it? They surprise you. Something I don't think that's talked about enough for those of us who write historical fiction. There's the time that you're researching and writing. There's also the time that in which you're living and writing the book. And then there's the third time when you're being read, that context, right? And in this case, three very different times. I mean, we're in a time, would we all agree, that's
unprecedented.
Unprecedented, if I hear that word one more time, but it's true, right? What do you think about that? And I mean, you couldn't have imagined that this would be the time of reading.
True, and it's funny. When I was collecting my characters, I was thinking like, oh, goody, I have such a variety to choose from. Whereas if I'm setting something in Ireland in the 1850s, everyone's going to look exactly like this. They'll all be blue-eyed even. Introducing into The Wonder, for instance, an English nurse. That was my diversity element. Whereas Paris in the 1890s, a dazzling choice. But at the point where I was writing the novel in 2022, it would just have seemed to me to be an obvious literary virtue to have a varied cast. But at the point where I'm publicizing it in America in 2025, it seems like a political statement. And I find myself thinking, does it really need saying that any train is more interesting if the passengers are varied? And, same with a novel and same with a country.
Right. 1895 Paris. Let's kind of go back there for a sec. I mean, it was booming. Obviously know it so well. I mean, you've been living in that time, but how does it relate to this time?
I suppose it was, well, one thing I'm very aware of through writing this book is that it was a place that embraced technological change, right? So the Lumiere brothers have just produced their first little film. They're about to do one of people getting off a train. It was a time of the excitement of new tech, and I try and put across the sheer excitement of that in my book. I've got people with portable typewriters, and Alice Guy, who's the secretary of Monsieur Gaumont, and you'll know his name from the film studio, but she was there, asking to borrow the movie camera from work and try out little clips, and he's thinking, what do you mean? Who would ever want to watch those? So I've got people on there like Fulgence Bienvenue, another great name, who was a one-armed railway engineer who had this vision for a metro for Paris, a subterranean railway in the city. There are people on there selling cars. There are people on there on bicycle holidays. So there's all sorts of people who are excited by the new technologies. But of course, the novel is also about, a train system which regularly killed people, not passengers typically, but workmen on the line. They were so frequently mutilated that the railway companies all kept surgeons on call to run up and do amputations. And nothing was allowed to stop the trains. And of course, writing this in 2022 and then, publishing it this year, I'm very aware of all those contemporary technologies that we embrace for the sake of speed, convenience, or just the kind of shiny new toy aspect of them, but that similarly have bad effects on, our environment, our society. So the one connection I did find between those two eras, I suppose, is the question of tech and how, your attempt at a high-speed, frictionless experience is nearly always based on somebody else's work. One character I enjoyed including was, nowadays I think caffeine as a sort of speedy chemical, which I love myself, it's very associated with travel. It's like, I'm going to dash into Paris, so I need my cup of coffee. And so when I spotted a sort of human coffee pot in a painting in the Historical Museum in Paris, I thought, I have to have him on my train, because he's a North African man wearing a gigantic metal tank of hot coffee on his back strapped to him, and he's selling little cupfuls from taps on his chest. And I thought, having a human coffee pot is a lovely way of saying, your coffee is supplied by someone. Someone has to carry this tank. It's not just, automatically coming out of a machine. Somebody's carrying this giant tank so that you can have your little shot of espresso on the platform.
Well, it's also, what you're saying is it already speed and the mechanisms that rule our lives today were already dominating, or already the shiny and more important than human life. But of course, and without ruining anything, human life exerts itself at the end of the story in a wonderful way.
Yeah, in many ways we are still living in the world the Victorians made for us, because a lot of us live in houses that were built by then. We drive around cars with an internal combustion engine, which is pretty much the same as in the 1890s. I did the first half of my tour on Amtrak trains. A lot of these technologies are still around, or some equivalent of them. Like they would telegraph ahead to say that the train was running behind. In London, they had a postal service 12 times a day. So really. Okay, yes, the internet has made some changes, but still we're living a very speedy life, just like these people in 1895, and really not at all like people in 1700. So as a kind of way of understanding the modern world, I find it very helpful to go back to a moment that, is a century and a quarter ago, but in many ways feels very like now.
Do you have a reader in mind when you write? Do you have it?
Just the perfect reader, Yeah.
Who is that? Who is that?
And the thing is, they've no particular nationality or age or gender. You might be able to generalize. I've never asked my publisher, but, I'm sure that, women maybe between 40 and 70 would make up a lot of my readers. But I don't write specifically for any demographic. I just write for a sympathetic, intelligent, interested reader. And I know that reader doesn't have all the time in the world. So I can never assume that they're reading a book continuously. Though this week I had the great luxury of reading Carol's novel, Three Stages of Amazement, continuously on my book tour and absolutely lapping it up. So I think that is the ideal way to read a book, uninterrupted. But no, most readers I know will be reading a little chunk each day, possibly 10 minutes before they go to bed each night. But I know that they will be very willing to do, some work and try and puzzle out who people are or what's going on. They don't want to be spoon-fed, but nor do they want to be completely confused or befuddled either. And they don't want you to sort of cheat them by, for instance, if you're going to make them curious about who killed somebody, they don't just want you to bring on some total stranger at the end and say it was him. So there's an implied contract. Most obviously with a murder mystery or a suspense novel, but there's always an implied contract. And I really try and think a lot about what the reader knows or guesses or wonders at each stage. Yeah.
Is there a message in this book? That line, this is a beautiful line, so I'm going to read it, which seems very apropos for where we are right now. Blonska, who's I kind of think of her as the Russian fairy godmother of the book. How to carry on minute by minute when you don't know how long you've got.
Yeah, it's funny, when I began writing the novel, I thought, a train is like a novel, and they are very intertwined traditions in that trains gave people time to read as they traveled in a way that you couldn't if you were, holding the reins of the horse or even turning your own steering wheel. So I was very aware of, books and trains as intertwined. But then as I was working on it, I became more and more aware of the train as an image of a human life, in that you think you've got all the way till Paris. You think you've got the full 8 hours, but your journey could be ended at any moment. So yeah, sometimes it seemed to me an image of an entire society plunging on heedlessly, but sometimes it felt like an image of an individual life. Yeah, and it made me very, very aware of mortality.
Yeah, full stop. Are you working on something new?
I'm always working on something's new. Yeah. Never having had a real job, I've been doing this since I began my first novel at 19, and I'm 55 now. So I go out of my way to prevent boredom. I will let myself like sneak off and cheat on the novel by writing a short story, without telling the novel, that kind of thing. Or I will like, have a film script on the side as well as the novel. Whatever the official thing I'm meant to be working on is always, it's not that it's necessarily dull to me, it's just sometimes it feels a bit like a stressful obligation. Whereas future novels that I'm just beginning to imagine into being, they're delicious because they're perfect. They have no actual words yet. They're like a pure dream. So yes, I'm always working on other things too. So at the moment I'd be working on my next novel, which I can't tell you about because I haven't sold it yet. And I might jinx it if I blab at Book Passage and then my publishers don't like it. But I'd also be working on, I'm doing my first musical for a Canadian theatre festival about Irish immigrants during the famine who settled in Canada. And actually that one's oddly political too, because to write about immigration and, the hostility to immigrants and, all the things they said about the Irish in the 1840s that they say about other migrant nations now. Those waves of being like despised, the dirty germ spreading outsider, and then of course you end up absolutely, as a founding part of the country you settle in. So yes, I'm writing a play with traditional Irish songs called "The Wind Coming Over the Sea," and we'll do that this summer.
Oh, that sounds beautiful. I'm thinking you're going to go back to that little window where you put the baby in Paris. What did you all catch that when she was talking about that?
They still have those hatches. I was just hearing somebody on the radio, and I was just last night in Boise, Idaho, and they were talking about a hatch for leaving babies. I think any society where there has been a lack of reproductive rights for women is going to have to use measures like hatches for baby handovers. Yeah.
Right. I want to open it up to everybody, but are there any myths, writing myths that you want to dispel, having the mic in your hand?
Oh,
right
what a
now?
Nice invitation. Yes. I don't know who came up with write what you know. And it may have been intended as good advice, like, instead of writing some generic, exciting novel, maybe, use the details that you're intimately familiar with. But I'm afraid a lot of writers, or student writers in particular, seem to think that you should only write what you know. And, in my case, I ran out of material about halfway into my second novel because one novel was set at my university and one was set at my high school. I had nothing else in my life. So I think you should write what you can imagine, and the resources to help you form an informed imagining via the internet have never been more easily within reach. So, if I suddenly formed a curiosity about, I don't know, high finance in Tokyo, I know nothing about that right now, but I'm sure I could find out. So yes, I think people should write, what they know plus everything else. And the other thing I always warn people off is trying to kind of beat the market by guessing what's going to be in fashion. And, it takes several years to write a book and then probably at least another year to publish it. So you're unlikely to be able to guess what will be selling well 3 years from now. So I think just, write what you are burningly curious about.
Yeah, write what you want to know.
Yeah.
Right. Any questions?
I have a mic I will pass around.
Oh, fantastic.
One right here.
I knew I was going to have a question. I want to just have an admiration, if I may, which is that I have never once in any of your books seen the note card, seen the piece of really cool stuff you learned in your research that you had to include in the novel. I've never seen that. I've learned stuff, Slammerton, I've learned about who can afford to use candles because one of the characters needed to know that. And I got to know it too. And I just wanted to say out loud that I'm just so impressed that you never let me down. You always managed to teach me things that I didn't know I needed to know. I read Haven because you wrote it. If someone had said to me, here's a novel about 3 monks in olden times on an island, I would have said, oh, please, let me put it in this pile and then start a fire. And I read it and was enthralled by it. Also outraged, but that's another story. But I think the thing just turned on. Okay, what I said was nice stuff about Emma. I understand. So I just wanted to say thank you.
Thank you. I know.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm just going to repeat the gist of that excessive praise of me, in case anybody at the back didn't hear it. My best loyalist fan, Deborah, was saying that she doesn't see the note cards, meaning like when there's some interesting factoid on my page, it doesn't look to her like, oh, here's a fact I'm being taught, that I incorporate them. And that is indeed a great challenge of historical fiction, that if you find yourself, if you're reading through your draft and there's some interesting nugget, but if your point of view character on that page wouldn't have some good reason to say it or to think it, then you have to cut it out, because you're not writing fiction in order to educate. The education is secondary. First of all, they have to care, they have to believe in these characters. So yeah, I remember with my first historical novel, Slammerton, Mary Saunders didn't care who the king was, so I don't think I mentioned who the king was because it was irrelevant to her. So yeah, I try and be really loyal to each point of view character and what they think. Thank you so much.
But she also said in the process how much she's learned, and that's delicious in writing and reading historical fiction, right? You learn, you enter a world, and you become part of that world. So.
And I'm so grateful to readers for their willingness to go places they didn't think they wanted to go. Yes, quite a few of my friends have been like, early Catholic monks on an island, Emma? Really? We have to go there? But, I suppose I feel a sense of compulsion when I come across a really interesting story or when I imagine one. And I feel a similar sense of kind of mission. Like, I think you could all find this interesting too, even though it's not something you're currently asking for. But come with me. Come with me in my magical mystery time machine.
You write short stories. I was very happy to hear. Would you describe the difference for you in the process of writing a novel and writing a short story? What's the difference between the two forms, and how do you feel about the two?
Oh, good question. I suppose a short story and a novel are similar, but a short story is delightfully short, meaning you can write it in a burst of interest, and it doesn't feel, as a writing process, weighed down the way really any novel in the end will be weighed down by how much of your life you've had to put into it. So I have sometimes written short stories about cases that could easily have become novels in terms of their potential, but I didn't want to spend 2 or 3 years with these people. I once wrote about a sort of end of days cult in 18th century Scotland who locked themselves up in a barn without food to wait for the rapture. And you could get 3 juicy novels out of that, but I didn't want to spend that long in the barn. I was like, how bad the barn's going to smell after just a short story is all. So they also allow you to try out genres that, again, you might not feel confident about your ability to keep up for the full length of a novel. They let you do experiments. I wrote one short story in the form of a list. I was trying to sum up the life of this particular medieval mistress of a king, and I thought I'm going to do it as a list of how many years she spent and how many things she owned and so on. So they're wonderfully accommodating of experiment and of just trying things out. So they're a glorious form. I would say the only problem I find with short stories is that some readers don't want to read short stories because they want to be able to escape into the novel and just live there and pretend that it's real to them for a long extended period. Lovers of short stories tend to be more literary in that they tend to know that what they're reading is literature rather than life, and they love that. Oh.
I'm curious about your research on becoming a train. Where do you start? What kind of sources are there? I can't imagine a lot of railroad workers writing memoirs or details.
No, you're right that they didn't write many memoirs, but there's a great book by a British station master. So he clearly found his job very stressful, and he documented all the worries he had about, missing parcels and leaking parcels and, customers with the wrong tickets and so on. And because of him charting the worries of his day, I was able to get a really detailed grasp on, how you would stack things up in the baggage van and, when the label might come off and how you might find where the parcel was meant to go, and which included looking for explosives, by the way. So that was very helpful. The novelist Émile Zola rode around with train drivers for several weeks, researching his novel La Bête Humaine, The Human Beast, and I found Zola's novel hugely helpful. So you're always stealing the notes of others. And I was using a lot of really good historians' accounts of trains too, and detailed stuff about the unions and pay and the pension age and so on. So I'm always drawing on the scholarship of others. So sometimes I feel that to say I researched the novel is a fallacy. Again, it's a frictionless statement, ignoring the labor of all the other people which has gone into that. And I'm also very grateful that trains as a hobby, a specialist interest, have tended to appeal to so many men on the internet. So there's lots of elderly Englishmen who with detailed videos of how they restored a train carriage, and then they'd even do a little video of them operating it, and you get to understand, how they moved the handles, because it's never just pressing a button in those days. It was always like pulling something or rotating something. And then lots of detailed Wikipedia entries, arguing over the Westinghouse air brake and how it worked. So I'm just so grateful to the mansplainers. They can mansplain away as far as I'm concerned. Bless them all.
We're lucky to have two such great authors here speaking with us, and I just want to give a shout out to Carol. I love 3 Stages of Amazement. I loved Rise the Euphrates, and I'm looking forward to reading more of your books, Emma. And the question I have for you, you talked about sometimes you get in the middle of writing this novel and you just want to go write a short story, play hooky, whatever.
Cheat. Yeah.
Cheat. Yeah. So have you ever gotten to writing a novel where you just thought, I just don't want to do this anymore, I'm going to put this one away and not continue? Or can
Yeah, once or twice I have not abandoned but shelved things at the 10,000 word stage. I get that far in and I realize there's some obstacle. So I don't have any books that publishers have refused to publish, but I certainly have a couple where I stopped. But say one of them, I'm now going back a few years on, I was asked for a novella. So I was like, I have something novella shaped. I can go back and reshape it into a novella. I do lots of recycling. Like my first TV script got cancelled because the producer was found guilty of sexual harassment. And I thought, it's not fair for my project to die a death because of his bad behavior. So I cobbled, I went back to that and turned it into a radio play and then into a stage play. So I think that kind of attitude of, make do and mend and what scraps do I have in my bottom drawer, I think they're very helpful to a writer. Basically, the less precious we can be about the whole process of writing, I think the more smoothly it'll go. Don't expect it to feel like this mystical contact by the muse every time, but cultivate a kind of a slightly workman-like attitude, And so, yeah, that certainly goes for using your abandoned scraps.
What's your day like? I mean, you have kids, you have a home life, you have all these things in various drawers at different stages. What's really
just, usually once one son is 21, our daughter is 17. So once she's gone to school, I just sort of open the computer. But what I'm doing on there could be buying a pair of shoes, or it could be writing the next novel, or it could be making travel arrangements for a tour. It could be responding to something that comes in, responding to proofreading or something. So it's an unstructured jumble, because I like the writing enough that I don't need to have elaborate rules for, dedicated time. So sometimes the day just absolutely flies by, and at the end I don't quite know what I've done. And so to save me from a feeling of like I'm just frittering away my time, I keep notes of what I get done each month. And then at the end of the year, I write up what I got done that year, and I write sort of resolutions for the next year. Like I say things like, don't take on any more film projects until another film comes out, Emma, because they can really suck up your time and often don't make it to the screen. Though my next film is on its way. I adapted H is for Hawk, the amazing memoir by Helen MacDonald.
Fantastic.
So I had the great pleasure of seeing Claire Foy starring in that. In Wales just before Christmas, and I can't wait to see that one, because it's such a privilege to get inside someone else's brilliant book and to poke around and see where the cogs fit together. And
when will that be out? Do you know?
I don't have a date yet,
but it's shot.
Yeah, it's shot and it's being edited. Yeah. And I mean, I'm slightly worried that all the besotted fans of that book will be annoyed with me, because of course it's a very genre blending book, which includes a lot of nature writing and sort of philosophical writing, and very little of that can make it into a feature film. So I feel I had to kind of, find the clear storyline in it. But any film adaptation, makes major changes because it is a totally different art form. So
We have a question back here.
Hi there. You mentioned all the great mansplainers on the internet. And I was curious, how much do you actually have to go in person to do research, say, when you were talking about Paris? Is that very common when you're writing historical fiction?
I wouldn't say it's essential at all. In fact, when I have written things that are set several centuries ago in places that still exist today, I don't go there first thing usually. Because when you go there and, there's another branch of Starbucks, it can all be misleadingly different to how it was back then. So quite often I have liked to write a draft or two of a novel before I go to the place. So it's not essential. No, it's sort of, in a way, it was the fact that I was going to live in Paris focused my mind on Paris and a curiosity about the history of Paris. But you don't have to walk those streets. I could have found that baby hatch in a book. It's mostly through books and archives that you go to the place. And the great thing is, when I was first reading historical fiction, maybe in the 1980s, there was almost always a bit at the start where it said, thank you to my lovely wife for driving me through all the villages in Belgium that summer to consult parish registers. And, so it seemed like really a hobby of the rich and leisured. But nowadays, it could be anybody with an internet connection. The internet has been a huge democratizer. And the source is available now with, newspaper databases that you can search by word, with, online genealogy sites, for instance. It's such a horde of biographical information on there. It's easier and easier to find out about anything you want to know. So yeah, that eating all the pastries there was really irrelevant but pleasurable. I could just have come to Corte Madera, of course.
Hi, thank you both for a great presentation. Emma, you underscore how important it is to be a keen observer. That what makes a good writer, right? Like the baby hatch, the signs on the post. My question is, how did you train yourself to become a screenwriter?
I went to the library, the university library, and I got like 30 books on screenwriting because I was quite intimidated by it as a genre. I'd never felt the need to get 30 books on novel writing. That just seemed like something you could kind of work out on your own. And, when I was growing up in the British Isles, we laughed at Americans doing MFAs in learning how to write. We thought, why do they need to study it? It's just something you work out for yourself, surely. And, that's changed now. Plenty of Irish writers would go and study creative writing. But, you don't absolutely have to. But with screenwriting, I did feel as if, it's a specialist topic. And, they have all their jargon and their third act climaxes and so on. And I felt I know nothing about this except that I love films, but I knew that I had a unique opportunity to get into screenwriting because my novel Room, there was interest in making it into a film, and I thought, this is my moment, you know. So I got a stack of books on screenwriting, and I wrote a first draft, and then luckily when the company I sold it to, when I got to meet Lenny Abrahamson, our director, he was very willing to work with me and with my script. And interestingly, he got me to discard quite a few of the changes I'd made. I had this impression that I had to really stick to the rules, you know, like one rule being come into the scene as late as possible and get out as early as possible. You know, act like you're a really busy business person, you know, dashing into the room. And he was like, well, no, if you want to write some impressively lean and mean script that someone will buy, maybe do it that way. But he said, Emma, you're already working with me on this. Like, you don't have to impress me. So, you know, he said, please, in this case, write the scenes long like a wildlife documentary, and I will make the cuts. So, you know, when you're basically, there are no hard and fast rules. I certainly found it very helpful, a lot of what I read, the sort of principles of, you know, everything contributing to the plot and the forward momentum. I mean, as novels go, The Paris Express is very momentum based, but of course there's still, it being a novel, there's time for long chatty conversations and things that seem irrelevant and just tiny hints sprinkled in. But a screenplay really does have to, you know, everything contribute to the moving forward of the plot. But what I learned from Lenny in making Room was that I didn't have to be, you know, wedded to any one so-called rule, you know, just, you know, be aware of things like how long the audience have been sitting in one spot. I mean, with any time-based art like plays or films, you are responsible for the kind of biorhythms of the piece, in that the audience, if they're sitting there for 3 hours, will probably start to get a bit antsy, and, you know, unless you're Scorsese and if they know that it's going to be 3 hours. And even then, cinemas had to put an interval into the Sacred Moon film. But with a book, people can take their own time at it. So there are no rules at all, because you can really sort of find your own way through a book, and a book can be very slim or very long or multi-part. So with films, I found the main kind of discipline was remembering the audience's sense of how much time has gone by and what the audience might be expecting in the way of, you know, ups and downs. I was born in Dublin, and like many big Irish families, we all expected to emigrate because there didn't seem to be any jobs there. So, you know, we scattered, and quite a few have gone back now, but I'm one of the ones who've stayed abroad. I got to Canada because I fell in love. You know, that's how they hook you, you know. So I emigrated first to England at the age of 20 to do a PhD, which was meant to be 3 years. And because I started writing novels, it was 8 years. And then instead of going back to Ireland, I went to Canada, and I've been in Canada ever since. I think emigration is particularly helpful as an experience for a writer, actually. If I was going to recommend one experience, well, two maybe, like have a baby and emigrate, because both of those are a shocking journey into an entirely new situation where new things will be asked of you. They're both moments of culture clash and jet lag. Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for the questions. This has been lovely.
Thank you, everyone.
It's been way more than lovely. It's been fantastic. You two should go on the road. I mean, you on a train.